Hi, this is Paul. Modernity is dying. I don't think there's any better way to say it. Modernity is dying. You can see it happening in politics. You can see it happening in culture. These things take a very long time to happen and work through the system, but all the signs are there. And as a culture that has been dependent upon modernity for its own consensus, that consensus that affords stability and coherence and unity, the death of modernity is a very big deal. Dr. Jim is one of the most insightful conversation partners that that has found me in the whole YouTube journey that I've been on. And he raised the issue with respect to the new atheists. And I thought it was a very incisive point. You don't see people arise to defend something unless they feel it is threatened. And we saw this both in the rise of new atheism in response to the 9/11 attacks and the seemingly strange emergence of this new brand of Islamic fundamentalism that drove airplanes into the Twin Towers and into the Pentagon and has fueled unrest in the Middle East. Now, the exact nature of that movement is, I'm no expert on it, but it's important in that these aren't traditional people just finding new tools. ISIS and Al Qaeda recruited, in a sense, postmodern neo fundamentalists from the ranks of individuals with middle class incomes, in the case of Osama bin Laden, huge wealth, Western educations, Enlightenment virtues, and these became the new fundamentalist warriors. It was YouTube and other social media recruited men and women out of Western Europe and the United States to go and fight in Syria, fight and die in most cases, and get themselves stuck. Whereas in some ways, the new atheists portrayed the rise of Islamic fundamentalism as a throwback. What they failed to see was that these are in fact the next wave. Now, with all the peculiarity of their particular religion, Rod Dreher has made this point with, I think it's I haven't read the novels, Hollaback, as wrote a novel about basically Islam conquering Western Europe. And of course, Douglas Murray has looked at this. This is the new wave. And so it's a bit of a fight against an old man that new atheism perpetuated against American fundamentalist Christianity and American traditional religion as sort of a proxy against who they really wanted to call out. But they didn't see the distinction. They didn't see that the rise of Islamic fundamentalism was not simply an archaic grabbing back at ancient things, but was in fact an ancient modern reappropriation, which in some ways is deeply postmodern. So, this reaction that Dr. Jim noted was something that you see in most 19th and 20th century modernist theology and often philosophy. The philosophical lights saw the recession of, or the losses that modernity was bringing on early, and in fact tried to perpetuate the gains and successes and accomplishments of Christianity and bring them into modernity. And so many of the commentaries behind me, I mean, I could pull them out because in many ways you know them by the particular commentary series. These are ways to try to say, okay, the world has been disenchanted, but we can find a way to believe the Bible anyway. That's in contrast to, in some ways, this series is more postmodern or neo-traditional, because it basically says, nuts to modernity. Modernity was the wrong path. Let's go back and read church fathers and try to appropriate something from the scriptures from them. Now, in some ways, this intervarsity, ancient Christian commentary on scripture, which, for the most part, these commentaries are just compilations of church fathers and from their sermons, and so in a Christian way, they're comparable to Islamic fundamentalists. They're postmodern in that they look at modernity and shrug and say, what have you done for me lately? I'm going back to the ancients. But we don't read the ancients like an ancient would have read the ancients. Our world has changed. Our frames have changed. There's too much within modernity we're not looking at or willing to just throw away. And so, again, I think Dr. Jim's real insight is sort of Shakespearean in that it seems the new atheists do protest too much. They feel modernity slipping away, and so that became fully obvious with the rise of the hoaxers and the war between the old new atheists and the atheism plus community. Because the atheism plus, I think, at a deep level recognized that just plain old atheism doesn't afford much of a moral foundation. Reason tells you what you can do with the modernist tools that you have, but it struggles to tell you what you should do. And so in a strange way, the old new atheists, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and really the IDW space, many of whom were basically new atheists attempting to hang on to modernity in the way that, let's say, someone like Harnack or a bunch of Harnack or Boltzmann were trying to save Christianity from the acids of modernity. These new atheists are trying to save modernity from the acids of postmodernity, and of course that came to full flourish in the IDW. And you see that war waged with James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian and many in this IDW space saying, no, modernity isn't going to go quietly into the night. The irony, of course, is that both the traditional modernists or the classical liberals versus the postmodernists, who aren't consistently postmodern because there's real questions as to whether or not one can actually live as a human being and be successfully postmodern. It's man does not live on skeptical acid alone. So you see that break, and so again, all of these I think are confirmation of Dr. Jim's recognition and Jonathan Peugeot's recognition. I think John Vervaeke's recognition that modernity is going away and there's no saving her. Now, Peterson, of course, there's a special place in my heart for Jordan Peterson. There always will be. But Peterson again, I think was much more of an ancient modern. In that sense, Peterson, I think, really irritated the social justice tribe because Peterson, with his strange Jungian appropriation of Christianity was in some ways analogous to this commentary series. It's looking back, but of course, Peterson through Jung and his own take on Jung, because one of the things that I've been schooled at in this whole business is the various takes on Jung, and many argue, philosophers argue that Peterson doesn't get Nietzsche or others right. Jungians argue that Peterson doesn't get Jung right. These are just normal in terms of both the academy and churches. But Peterson is a preacher. He's an academic and he's a scientist. But in terms of the mode he was in his rise, he was fundamentally a preacher. And the biblical series both was sort of an appropriation of ancient modern with modernist science built in. Remember, he was not a Newtonian, he was a Darwinian. And so again, Peterson was a breed in some ways separate from the Weinsteins and the hoaxers and certainly the classical new atheists of Dawkins and Shermer and those in the IDW. There was a terrific article in Quillette about the challenge of Marxism, and the link will be below. If you haven't read it, it's a must read. Now, what I think was enlightening to me from the piece was how clearly the article illuminated modern liberalism's vulnerability. And as with almost every movement, the strengths and the vulnerabilities come hand in hand. And so modern liberalism promotes liberty, equality, reason, and individualism. But it's the strength of its individualism makes it rather blind to the group dynamics. And Marxism comes along and says, hey, people cooperate in order to compete. Something that Brett Weinstein says, or at least used to say regularly. And people cooperate in order to compete. And so, people are, one of the ways, one filter to look through history with is the filter of groups. And so, of course, you've got the classic 19th century Marxist language. And this article nicely shows how the Frankfurt movement and now the critical theory sort of update the language, and now instead of having predominantly socioeconomic working class groups, remember Marx is dealing in Europe, and when Marx is dealing in Europe, you're still having a lot of racial ideas about kind of a social Darwinian going on. But Marx is paying attention to other dynamics, and these, of course, have been rejiggered. The weakness, of course, in the Marxist analysis, which has been pointed out and exposed again and again, is that you can accumulate people into innumerable different groups. And actually, the intersectionality that gets raised, as Jordan Peterson noted many times, if you actually think intersectionality through, it undoes a lot of the dynamics. Sure, you can gain wisdom and insight looking at how different groups compete and looking at how different groups, in a sense, construct a principality within that group that affords members of the groups privileges and advantages in competition against other groups. This is an important and not an insight that, of course, Marx has. It's a common political insight. Why do nation states develop? Why do ethnic groups cohere? Why do family members trust one another or will never trust one another? Why does Why do American sports work? All you need is a flag and a mascot and a locality within a sport, and suddenly you have a tribe and they can act together and they can celebrate together. I mean, this is sociology 101. It's sociology of religion. So groups do this. So the strength of Marxism is that, yes, groups compete, and individuals within groups cooperate in order to have an advantage over members of other groups. That the blind side to that is there are potentially innumerable groups, and people very quickly change hats and change roles from one aspect to another. Right now, I might be a citizen of Sacramento and have certain ideas, but then suddenly when your nation is attacked from maybe there's competition with another state, then I'm a Californian and not a Sacramentan competing with the Bay Area, and I'm a Californian competing with Texas, and then suddenly I'm an American competing with China, and I'm a Dutchman competing with English Presbyterians, or I'm someone of Jewish descent looking askance at the terribly apologetic Germans. You know, the amazing capacity of human beings is that we can change these hats and we can change these roles all the time. And so continuing to insist on one particular tiny thing, well, it gets old. And in that sense, so if you focus on just oppression, well, now we can accumulate a group of the oppressed. But that breaks down to, again, as Jordan Peterson and many others have noted, because we are oppressed in many different ways. And nearly every oppressor is also oppressed in another way. And everyone who is oppressed has oppressed in another way. So this thing goes on and on. Liberalism, as this article points out, just keeps losing to Marxism because of its inherent weaknesses. And this, again, is part of the reason that liberalism is going away. Because if you just keep losing a certain fight, I remember people critiquing Christianity as seen through the lens of new atheist takedowns, that many observers to those debates would just say, well, Christianity just keeps losing, so why would I back a loser? This is deep human psychology and sociology. And so liberalism just keeps losing to Marxism. So if the benefits of modernist liberalism are going to survive, finally, the acids of Marxism, they're going to have to rejigger some of their DNA and develop an immunity to resist it. Otherwise, the organism is going to die. The problem that Marxism has is it itself has some fundamental flaws, and in that sense is less durable than modern liberalism because it can't live more than 70 or 80 years. Marxists' promises are empty because they somehow imagine that people who are oppressed, once they get into power, are naturally good and will not oppress anyone else. And it's just simply false. Hurt people. Not always, but often. And human beings, when they are given power, will be corrupted by that power. And those who supposedly were the underdogs who are now somehow safe to rule. Now pay attention during I've often made the comment that in American politics you have Republicans and Democrats, and there are archetypal constructs behind both. That Democrats are about kindness and Republicans are about strength. Now, if you listen to the speeches at the Democratic convention, again and again and again, you will hear, well, now they're dealing with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And so what are they going to forefront in terms of their stories? They're going to forefront the sufferings of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Now, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have both been enormously successful individuals in American society. They are very famous, very well known, and Joe Biden is now up in years, but if he were younger, sort of like Barack Obama after the presidency, you're not going to have any more financial concerns. You can give speeches for individual speeches for six figures. You can write a book and it will sell. You are always in demand. So these are high status people. Even if they lose the election, they will remain high status people. But when you listen to the speeches that are given about them, the recommendation speeches that are given about them, you will hear litanies of their suffering. Joe Biden grew up in a working class family. Joe Biden took the train. A bunch of popularist images. Joe Biden lost his wife. Joe Biden lost his son. Joe Biden has sacrifices. In other words, the suffering that they have. Kamala Harris, she's not white. Kamala Harris's ethnic identity, again, casts her as someone who has suffered, someone who understands suffering. This is all about the narrative of kindness. Now, when you get to the Republican nominations, you're going to hear litanies of they held the line here, they held the line there, they resisted the opposition, they persevered, they are, in other words, with the Democrats, we have heroics of suffering, and with the Republicans, we have heroics of strength. And so, again, if you look at this, map this on masculine and feminine, the Democrats are using a fairly feminine appeal, and the Republicans are using a fairly masculine appeal. Okay? And of course, that plays in a very complex ways to men and women, because all men and women are mixtures of masculinity and femininity, and in terms of themselves. There are men who are very masculine and men who are quite a bit more feminine, and there are women who are more feminine and women who are more masculine, and of course all of that is really getting played with now. But liberalism has this flaw, and Marxism keeps winning with it, but Marxism can't finally endure because of its own critical flaws. And so for liberalism to actually endure, it's going to have to change. And changes are, in fact, coming. Now, should the neo-trads rejoice? Well, there was a tremendously well-written article. Cale Zeldin notified me on Twitter and said, when I was thinking of you when I drafted this, and it's very estuary-like in terms of, there's the tweet. It's very estuary-like, and let me get down to the link. There's the link. This is a haunting, deeply insightful. Rod Dreher even picked it up and posted it on his blog. Things are broken. We need to upgrade our sense-making apparatus. So clearly, listening to my channel, listening to Rebel Wisdom, but this is a loyal, believing member of the Roman Catholic Church, and he's saying, it's things need to change. Now obviously I watched Bishop Barron's, really enjoyed it. Bishop Barron's very interesting, I should find it a sec. Bishop Barron's, Napa Institute keynote, Pope Francis and Vatican II. Very interesting talk. He was talking about traditional Roman Catholics who are unhappy with Pope Francis, and talking about how, all of this goes back to Vatican II, and so what we really need to do is sort of figure out what was right about Vatican II and what was wrong about Vatican II, and of course, Roman Catholic theology is quite nuanced, but basically Bishop Barron complaining that you can't pick and choose between this certain level of decision making. If you're doing that, we have a name for that. You're a Protestant. But then he goes on to give a really lovely explication of the missiology of Vatican II, which in Dutch Reformed tradition would have sounded positively Kuyperian, following the ideas of Abram Kuyper, another Protestant. But it was interesting that Barron, is noting, the disagreements in the church and the trying to work through their, the differences in the church right now. And again, I'll have the link to this below. This is a haunting, well-written, deeply moving piece. And of course, Rod Dreher went from being a Roman Catholic to being Orthodox, because in very much a neocon, a neo-traditional, not a neocon, That's political. A neo-traditional mode because Rod Dreher wanted to practice Roman Catholic family planning and went to his local priest and asked his priest for guidance and pastoral guidance, and his priest rolled his eyes and said, "Oh, you're one of them." And at that point, Rod Dreher says, I don't care to be in a church whose leadership, especially given the theology of who priests are in the Roman Catholic ecclesiastical system, this institution is corrupt, and he became Orthodox. So I don't know that neo-trads should rejoice so much. There's sort of the magisterial neo-traditionalists out there, those who in the Roman Catholic world want to go back to the Latin rites. Let's act as if Vatican II never happened. Evangelicals going to Orthodox, like Father David in Dallas and Jonathan Peugeot. And even in the Reformed camp, the magisterial Reformed camp, you have the young, restless, and Reformed movements with John Piper and Mark Driscoll, and many Southern Baptists becoming basically English Presbyterian-ish, except that they don't baptize babies. And again, this is all part of the waning of modernity and a desire to, you can't really go back, but a desire to reappropriate what was before. So just as, some of my Reformed colleagues, this is the commentary series they really eat up if they're sort of going the Reformed Catholic Dutch Reformed version, whereas if you follow Tim Keller or the Gospel Coalition, these guys are going, early modern or mid-modern with Puritans, and some, not, some going back to Calvin, but it's amazing how little Calvinists actually quote Calvin. They're often quoting theologians 100 or 200 years after Calvin within that tradition. But this isn't unique in this neo-trad wave, isn't unique within Christianity. Again, just recently, modern Stoics, and it's like, well, that's interesting. Modern Gnostics, and again, self-consciously Stoic or Gnostic. Revivals of these ancient traditions. One of the interesting things in the estuary conversation was, can I join the estuary? Can we make the estuary? And my answer, I know, not satisfying some, is let's work on making some estuaries together, and we'll continue to talk about that. But again, there's no real going back. You can appropriate what was behind, but there's no undoing modernity. We're talking over the internet right now. And I know, you even saw a while ago, you had people writing in moleskins. And, okay, I'm not going to use PDAs. I'm not going to use an iPhone. I'm going to write in moleskins. But no, iPhones aren't going away. So I want to go back to this video. And I talked about this video a while ago. Ross Douthat, Tara Isabella Burton, I often get her name wrong, and Steve Smith, The Next American Religion. And if you haven't watched the video, the whole video is well worth watching. And Ross Douthat, Tara Isabella Burton, has been sort of keeping the beat on the kinds of religions that Clay Rutledge has noting, that when people give up Christianity, they don't become and increasingly less so. They don't become Sam Harris rational. Even Sam Harris has a meditation app. They look to all kinds of new things. And as Clay Rutledge pointed out in his book, UFOs, astrology, this is what people are doing. Now, one of the individuals in there that I knew the least of the three was Stephen D. Smith, who teaches constitutional law at San Diego School of Law. He's got his I don't know if he's got his undergrad from Brigham Young. He's a Mormon, or at least from the past in Mormons. He taught at Notre Dame for a while. He's currently a professor in San Diego, a professor of law. And so we're going to spend some time with him. One of the things that I'm working on is starting. So right now I have my main channel that you're watching this on. I have my church channel that church stuff is going on. And so part of the way to kind of understand the Estuary Livingstone's online differentiation is, so in many ways, my channel carries the estuary content. The church channel carries the church content. And I'm going to start a third channel, a clips channel. Now, I know clips channels seem so 2017, 2018, but I often find YouTube clips that I want to see them out there standing alone. Usually they're from smaller channels. I might take some little clips of my own channel. I'm kind of thinking I might do just a little short introduction to the clip, contextualizing a little bit, and it'll be a real challenge for me to do something short. But so I want to take some of the stuff from Stephen Smith and probably make some clips, because these are videos that have 500 or 1,000 views. So hardly anybody has seen them. His book, Christians and Pagans in the City, I think, at least from what I've got the book on order. I ordered it used. There are still some used copies out there cheap. Those of you who want to get it fast, instead of having to pay full price. So I'm going to do a clips channel because I want to get some more clips out there of probably some people that I'd like to see. I'll probably have some Jordan Peterson clips on there too. A lot of the things I do for my own reasons, often so that I can just find things myself. I mean, many people, those of you who know where my blog is, sometimes people comment on the blog, why are you posting this? Why are you promoting this? It's like, I don't use my blog to promote anything. My blog gets hardly any traffic. I use my blog to post things so that I can find them later. That's why I use my blog. And if I want to write something a little longer that I want to share, I use my blog so I have a space to write it and share the link. My blog gets 400 or 500 hits a day, and over stuff I've had on that blog over the last 15 years. So when you see something on my blog, I'm not necessarily promoting it. I'm just noting it because I want to be able to find it. And so I'm kind of thinking about using a clips channel in the same way, because there are clips I want to see, and I'll share the link to the clips channel. And if you find those clips helpful, go ahead and use them. Anyway, I don't know if I'm going to play this video. Basically, someone sent me this video, and I thought it's a really helpful video. It's a very short one. It's about the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, the religiously unaffiliated. Talks about them basically rising, and this is the fastest growing segment, religious segment in the American population. These are many Christians deconstructing, or Christianity. Let's say grandma went to church faithfully, mama went to church on Christmas and Easter, and now kids don't go to church at all. But as Tara Isabel Burton and her work notes, that these people are finding all sorts of interesting religions. Part of what they talked about in the Douthat piece was, at that point, Marianne Williamson was continuing her bid for the Democratic nomination, which really didn't go anywhere. Douthat made a critical observation that he said, if this happened in the 19th century, there likely would have been a church that formed around her, similar to Mary Baker Eddy, the Seventh-day Adventists, Joseph Smith, the Latter-day Saints. In the 19th century, these religious, and Douthat writes about that quite well in his Decadence book. In the 19th century, these religious prophets or religious lights or religious zealots founded churches after them. Church of Christian Science. Scientology is sort of a more modernistic, made-up thing. It seems like much more of a money grab, although I'm sure many Scientologists are sincere. The whole thing just looks to me like a con. But not so for Christian Science, for Jehovah's Witnesses, for Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Seventh-day Adventists. Now, I think over long periods of time, And these are usually called sects, sects, and especially what we've seen in, let's say, the Seventh-day Adventists is they're increasingly becoming assimilated into the more dominant strains of Christianity. One might argue, in fact, that the dispensational movement could be clumped in with them, except dispensationalists generally affirm the Trinity. And for many Trinitarian Christians, the Trinity is sort of this hallmark of the inside and outside of Christianity, much to the chagrin of biblical Unitarians like our friend Sam, if Sam always comes up as our chosen heretic, or Jehovah's Witnesses, or Latter-day Saints. But, each of them has their own particularities. And so the Seventh-day Adventists are increasingly sort of becoming enfolded into the rest of Christianity. Christian Science still sort of out there. But that's sort of the flow of this. But what we're seeing is that the religious unaffiliated, perhaps it's because via the internet, people can sort of clump up in different ways. You might have some, Wiccan comes up. You might have some Wiccan religions that come up, but right now groups don't seem to cohere very well, or perhaps these kinds of groups don't seem to cohere very well, and they don't tend to be durable. The Mormons were dramatically persecuted in the 19th century in the United States, and their persecution made them stronger, and they've endured and continued to grow. The Jehovah's Witnesses have endured and continue to grow. I think most of these new religiously unaffiliated ad hoc religions aren't going to last a decade. And that says something deep about our culture, and perhaps a critique of how weak our culture actually makes us. We don't know how to form. We don't know how to form churches. We don't know how to form religious organizations that can actually endure not just years, but decades and centuries. And so, again, I think long term, we will likely see the assimilations of the LDS and Jehovah's Witnesses, similar to what we're seeing in terms of the assimilations of the Seventh-day Adventists. But the point that Douthit made, I think, is really important. So you'll find a bunch of YouTube interviews with Tara Isabella Burton, and she's making the same points in all of them pretty much. And it's a point that we've covered with Clay Rutledge and others repeatedly. She's fun to listen to, and she's a clever journalist. I haven't picked up her book because I'm not quite sure. I will at some point. I buy way too many books already, but I might pick up her book because I am curious about. She's a journalist, and she's looking, but she has a theological degree from Oxford, and so she does understand, I would assume, how theology works and how religious movements and groups work. And the idea is that people think they're getting beyond religion, but as we're seeing with just about everything else, religion seems to be simply an enduring aspect of human beings. It's so deep it's such deep code in us that the word religion refers to sort of our basic operating system in the world. And I mean that word operating seriously, because these are the operations. It's the input output. I remember installing DOS, and I've been building my own PCs for years, and so I'm old enough that I used to install DOS. And I remember computers before hard drives. And so you had one floppy where you'd stick it in and you had your operating system on that 5 1/4 floppy. Then you'd stick in your other disk with your program on it and where your files were stored. That's how much computer memory, that's how much old computer stuff I remember. And so in a sense, the basic input output, the screen drivers, it's that operating system level is sort of where religion is at. And people don't pay any attention to religion. They're usually paying attention to the applications that are a layer above the religion. In some ways, Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke in cognitive science are paying attention sort of to the display drivers and to the other hardware drivers. That's sort of the interface. But the religion is sort of at the operating system level. And so beyond religion isn't reason. Reason can't function as a religion. Reason is much more a driver than an operating system. It sort of helps cohere different devices to your operating system and lets your operating system talk and helps the camera work and helps the mic work and helps the trackball work and all of these things. So reason is much more like a driver than it kind of connects the hardware and the software. But religion is much more the operating system. And people are, well, the operating systems they're working on are laden with viruses and pop-ups. Okay? And so beyond religion isn't reason. That's a category mistake. But mostly hometown buffet folk religion, because that seems to be where people are going. If as a pastor of a church who has some computer skills and many older people, I've often been called upon under the pretense of pastoral ministry to fix some senior citizen's computer. And for many people, it's not near as bad as it was 10 or 15 years ago. Don't click on that ad when the computer says, oh, you've been, your computer has a virus, click this to clean it. Don't click that. And so sort of what we've seen at the popular level is the operating systems have sort of gotten corrupted by all of these viruses. And so now people's operating systems are full of all kinds of other code, many of this very ancient code, and kind of updated to new things. So that seems to be these hometown buffet folk religion. Now, part of the going away of modernism is the increasing weakness of modernism's subtraction story. And the subtraction story, as Charles Taylor called it, C.S. Lewis talks about it. Many have seen the subtraction story, and it basically says, well, ancient people made up stories to account for the world, and we call that religion. And Enlightenment science showed that nature is dead or mechanical. There's nothing live there. The other day I was sitting in my backyard, and now with my 57-year-old eyes and my resistance to getting glasses, I'm looking at something kind of making a motion on the fence, and couldn't see it clearly enough. I didn't know if it was a bee or a cobweb that was just sort of being blown in the wind. And in that sense, you sort of get a sense of the subtraction story's confusion or hyperactive agency detector, as the new atheists like to call it, that, well, ancient people were simply confused by motion. And if it was motion, if it was moving, they thought it was alive. They didn't understand that motion is dead and the universe is dead. And there's no consciousness inside the sun. Now, of course, Rupert Sheldrake comes along and says, well, how do you know? Well, we don't ask questions like that because we've jiggered our operating system that says the sun is not conscious. And actually, some of that comes from Christianity. Secularity does come out of Christianity. But the Enlightenment science showed that nature is dead and mechanical, and people will abandon their magical thinking as it is pushed away by scientific thinking and reason. And so then people won't believe in astrology or UFOs or ghosts or anything like that. They'll just believe in Nacho Libre's tag team fighting member. I only believe in science. Well, people will abandon their magical thinking, and science and reason will resolve all of our problems and we'll all be happy. Well, no. And in case you're still clinging to this position, look at your own data. Look at the data around you. Modernity is going away, not humanity's belief in larger consciousness, other consciousness, humanity's belief in all sorts of things. It's not going away. The programming's in too deep, and modernity is actually going away. Now, even if you're a rather modernist Christian, like many are out there, because the truth is we're not one thing or another. We're all of these things blended in together at one layer or another, sometimes even surprising ourselves. This is causing some consternation because the deep agreements of modernity at least functioned in our society as a way for us to find coherence and agreements. And those are up for grabs right now. Now, After School, SKOOL, has some really fun doodles with a lot of stuff. And he's done some really good Jordan Peterson doodles. And this one on Jordan Peterson looking at Dostoyevsky's Notes from the Underground. And I mentioned before in a previous video, you can find a 10-minute summary. If you just do Notes from the Underground in 10 minutes, it'll come up. It's got over 100,000 views. It's by another psychologist who's sort of doing not really Jordan Peterson stuff, but a guy who's talking about meaning on another psychology professor who's talking about meaning on the internet. And I'll have the link below to that one too. And so, I started reading Notes from the Underground, and it is a powerful, penetrating book. The audio book is very well done for those of you who are on Audible. We are not the creatures the Enlightenment says we are, and Dostoyevsky just blows this out of the water, and Peterson is a master in representing that. And we're seeing this as if you live in one of the secure, affluent parts of the world. Why is the suicide rate going up? Why is there so much disorder? Why is it white middle-class kids in places like Grass Valley, California, with signs saying Black Lives Matter when there's no black life anywhere around them? And you see this all the time, and other people are celebrating that. But on the other hand, it's like there's something going on. Why was the suicide rate in Silicon Valley high schools so high? And Dostoyevsky basically laid this answer out before in the character of this underground man, contrasting himself from the modern man who acts and does and accomplishes. And in that sense, you can sort of understand the entire Jordan Peterson wave in that book, Notes from the Underground, because Jordan Peterson was this preacher illuminating people to no longer be literally underground in their mother's basement covered with Cheetos dust, but to rise up and to be a man of action and to get a job and commit to a woman and have a life and have a career and build a corporation and go out and do something real. And that's Jordan Peterson in his classical liberal modernist mode. But Dostoyevsky, and again, Peterson, there's no better preacher of Dostoyevsky in this book than Peterson. And you can hear it in that video. He basically takes Peterson from a lecture and puts it in there, and it's compelling stuff. It's Jordan Peterson at his best. But if you listen to the book, Dostoyevsky at his best. Dostoyevsky looks at himself and says, we would, even if we, through reason and science and modernity, achieved utopia for ourselves, and utopia looks something like Hugh Hefner's lifestyle, okay? Even if we were Hugh Hefner and had nothing to do but walk around in pajamas all day and have a never-ending supply of 20-year-old beauties to pleasure ourselves with, we'd smash it. And, we didn't see Hugh Hefner take a sledgehammer to the Playboy Mansion, but this is sort of what we're seeing in society overall. We will destroy our happiness out of spite. Once we learn that we're a piano key, we can't stand that accusation, and so we're going to do something that demonstrates we are not. We are not subject to our programming. We are going to transcend our assassin robot programming, and we are going to be free. And so, what is it? Oh, I can't. You get someone like Chris McCandless and Into the Wild, where here's a young man who's got, he's middle class. He's got parents that, have money to give him what he needs. He goes out into the wilderness and basically dies. And anybody who knows the wilderness would say, yeah, he's an idiot. He doesn't know the wilderness. Why is he going out here? Why does he live like we don't hole up in a bus. We work all year in order to survive and to have children and to teach them and do all that. But you modern folks, you're insane. And in some ways it's confirmation of Dostoyevsky's point. We are not the creatures the Enlightenment says we are. We will destroy ourselves out of spite. Nor are we what Marxists say we are. Oh, I'm simply the product of my sociology, and I am oppressed, but deep inside I'm good, so therefore once I get into power, I will be the benevolent dictator. Well, no, you won't. It doesn't work that way. We are not what the Enlightenment says we are. We are not what the Marxist says we are. If you get your anthropology wrong, almost nothing else will go right after that. And part of what made Jordan Peterson so powerful was he got a lot of his anthropology right. And he listened to Dostoyevsky, and he listened to Nietzsche, and he listened to Jung, and he listened to Christianity, and he listened to all sorts of other voices, and he says, we're not what the Enlightenment says we are, and we're certainly not what the Marxists say we are. And then, of course, Tom Holland comes along, and, secularity isn't what it appears to be either. We're deeply Christian in ways that we simply don't recognize anymore. And that's really the only way to understand who we are. We've imagined it's the absence of religion, as if we didn't need an operating system, but people can't see their own religion like fish can't see water. It's simply built too close to our own assumptions. And you'd ask your Windows computer, and your Windows computer would say, "What's Windows?" And so you're not going to have somebody that says, I'm Windows, I'm a Mac. We hardly know what we are. And secularism is sort of late stage Protestantism. And I, in this paper that I wrote, that maybe more on that later, we'll see what happens. But it's sort of the church's second secret sister that, civilizations all around the world looked at the church and said, we don't want you, but they took in secularism, and they sort of adopted her and made her their own. But India, Turkey, Japan, even Israel, to one degree or another, secular states. And communism, again, communism doesn't work. We know this. We've seen it tried in how many different places and how many different times and how many different cultures. It does not work. And again, people are like, well, it hasn't been tried. And it's like, have you read any history? No history reading. Well, good luck navigating forward. We'll talk about your operating system assumptions if you're that naive. Now, there was also another very interesting conversation with a foursome with Douthit. Was Wesley Yang? He's a reporter. Coleman Hughes, and I forget the other guy. Sometimes on the Sunday morning talk shows, talked about it as successor ideology. Rod Dreher with an interesting piece on wokeness as post-Protestantism from Joseph Bottoms, and Joseph Bottoms has written some interesting stuff over the years. But in some ways, these groups are mixtures of neo-traditionalists and like Dreher and Douthit, and modernists that are trying to not give up the fight like Coleman Hughes. But the question is, were we ever really secular? And that's where Stephen Smith's work comes in. And I'm going to make some clips of his work and post them on the other channel. The links to the main videos are here below. I highly recommend all three of those lectures and then the question and answer session. They seem to be done at Princeton University. These were some James Madison endowed lectures. And so the lecture is about 45 minutes and then about 45 minutes of question and answer. And the other people in the room, they ask top quality questions. And so all four of these videos are just absolutely top shelf. Stephen Smith decides to come at it from another point of view. Was paganism ever truly defeated? And I know this is hard for us to follow because we've sort of got Christianity and then Protestantism and secularism. And then, well, how are we to understand all of these terms? And so Smith tries, I don't think fully successfully, but his arguments are definitely, and he gives, a bunch of footnotes at the beginning, say, hey, look, I'm a legal scholar. So I'm not a historian. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a theologian. But I have to play in all of these fields, which, I myself am guilty of. I'm just trying to put the world together. And so I've got a thesis here and a schema for trying to sort out some of these things as maybe a potential path forward to see if we can figure out what's happened in the last 500 years. And in fact, what's happened in the last 2,000 years, because it's really important, and it's really important in terms of law and religion and our social fabric. And I think actually his ideas are very, very helpful, and his schema is well worth taking a look at. So in a sense, he says, and later on in some of the other lectures, he's challenged on these things, and he has to nuance them a bit. And those of you who have been following my God Number 1, God Number 2 will very quickly see where this intersects with the work that I've been doing. So he basically says that paganism is basically immanent religion. And Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are basically transcendental religion. So let's now very quickly, someone will say, hey, wait a minute. God Number 1 and God Number 2, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, transcendence. The whole earth is full of his glory, immanence. So isn't Christianity and Judaism both? I'm not going to talk about Islam because I don't know it well enough, but probably aspects of Islam. In other words, we're dealing with a spectrum here, and that's a fairly helpful tool to think about it. And he says, well, let's for a minute just deal with the poles and just, for the sake of clarification, recognize that there's a polarity here between immanent religion and transcendental religion. And let's see if that goes better than religion on and off, as if secular people don't have an operating system. And let's see if using these poles might help us. Now, these poles are easily map onto Two Worlds mythology, and so this very much does track with the Vervaeke work and all of this stuff. So let's try this approach and see if we can learn something. And what we often see is that we see religions at its purer forms, and then we see folk religions, which is more of a mixing and a melding. And now remember, he was in this panel with Tara Isabella Burton, who I think is very much working the beat of the folk estuary between the immanent and the transcendental. So let's get into this, and I'm just going to do an old style commentary on his presentation. His presentation is relatively brief in this one. It's far, far larger in the other videos.
Well, it's an honor for me to be here in this distinguished company to talk about some pretty interesting questions, I think. In my remarks, I'm going to try to do a couple of things. One is, as Ross asked me to do, to give a bit of a sense of the argument in the book that he mentioned, Pagans and Christians in the City. But then I also want to offer a few thoughts, speculative thoughts, on the significance of that argument for the question that's most central, I guess, to our discussion. Do we have, or are we on the verge of settling into some new American religion that would be post-Christian, maybe describable as some kind of paganism, but something that would serve the role that maybe non-sectarian Protestantism did in the 19th century, proposed by T.S. Eliot. Sectarian Protestantism did in the 19th century. So, in the book, I tried
using a different browser because I have to refresh this computer. Anyway, you don't need to know my technological woes. So this very much fits in with the religion that's not a religion, Brett Weinstein and Alistair McGrath. It almost sounds like you're proposing a new religion. The folk religiosity that seems endemic to humanity, that people don't go rational. And he talks about sort of this pervasive 19th century Protestantism. Now, of course, his background is Mormon, and so he's coming out of that. And this waspy, this waspy American culture is deeply rooted, and that waspy American culture, David Brooks writes about this fairly often, that waspy American culturishness is going away, and so what's going to replace it? And so you need an operating system
to develop and defend an idea that was proposed by T.S. Eliot. Eliot argued at one point that the future of the West would be determined by a contest between Christianity and what he called modern paganism.
Now, it's interesting. Again, T.S. Eliot, favorite of Dr. Jim, favorite of Esther, who brought him up with Douglas Murray. So T.S. Eliot, a contemporary of C.S. Lewis. At first, they didn't like each other. Later in life, they became friends. But again, someone of that mid-20th century meaning crisis mode, one of those luminaries. And so T.S. Eliot notes that, well, it seems the future is going to be a struggle between Christianity and sort of a new modern paganism.
He thought Western societies are currently Christian or classifiable as Christian, not because they're Christian in any very deep sense, but because they once had been Christian, and sort of by default they would remain classifiable as Christian until that was replaced by, I think he said, positively something else, which he thought had not happened yet. But maybe it has happened by now. Maybe the modern paganism that he mentioned has now prevailed. And that would at least be another way of raising the question that Ross raises here, I think. Now, Eliot offered this suggestion. He said, as a help with, he said, immediate perplexities that fill our minds. He said, the current terms in which we describe our society only operate to deceive and stupefy us. And that seems right to me. And so that seemed like it was an intriguing possibility to investigate and see whether his diagnosis would help with that. In particular, it does seem that the prophecies that were once almost universally believed about inevitable secularization have by now been pretty much discredited, or at least heavily qualified. But we still tend to describe constituencies or movements or positions by putting them into the boxes of religious or secular. And yet these descriptions often seem to obscure as much as they illuminate. On many issues, the parties on both sides of a controversy seem religious. They reflect a kind of evangelical zeal, a sort of good versus evil view of the world, a tendency to want to anathematize their opponents. Secular and Christian doesn't quite seem to capture that. It seems to...
And again, this says, with the recession of modernity and the fight between the classical new atheists and the atheist plus tribe, the religion isn't going away. People are acting religious. They're in the streets looking like Pentecostals, acting like they're woke.
Over a century ago, Chesterton said, what we see in the world is, quote, a fight of creeds masquerading as policies. And he went on to say, we've contrived to invent a new kind of hypocrite. The old hypocrite was a man whose aims were really worldly and practical, while he pretended that they were religious. The new hypocrite is one whose aims are really religious, while he pretends that they're worldly and practical.
That's Chesterton noting. Now, Chesterton's writing at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, sort of peak modernity. Modernity, I think, first begins its slide in the trenches of World War I. But again, these things move very, very slowly through cultures and through the world. But Chesterton saw it clearly.
That seems to me, if anything, more true today than it was when Chesterton wrote it. But the question is, how to describe these religious divides, and Eliot's diagnosis, it seemed, might be helpful in doing this. Now, that diagnosis, I think, generates a major objection, and that is that paganism just doesn't seem to be a term that describes, important positions or movements today. It is true we hear more about Wiccans and Satanists and so forth, and these are interesting movements and so forth, but not really politically and culturally salient, well, at least politically, let's say, actors, it seems, especially in the academy where I live. My progressive friends in the academy who have managed to read the book find the description of some of them as pagans as just either amusing or insulting, but just not plausible at all. Now, my response to that objection is to suggest that they're right in rejecting this if you equate paganism with myths about Zeus and Apollo and so forth, or with sacrifices and auguries and that sort of thing.
It's helpful to remember that this word paganism is a word, so Romans, citizens, people who lived in Hellenistic Antioch in Syria labeled Christians as Christians. Christians didn't label themselves in that way. And often we get named by others who see us because they're seeing an aspect of us that we struggle to see in ourselves. Christians then returned the favor to call pagans, paganos, which means basically people of the countryside, because Christianity became such an urban religion that it was the people of the countryside, the later adopters, that then became the word for non-Christians, and that word has stuck. And so it's a deep anachronism for us to look back at Romans and Greeks who are pre-Christian, or at least the pre-Christian takeover, and call them pagans because they were actually very urban people. But we're stuck with the language that we've got. And so he's noting that he looks around at his colleagues and says, well, you're pagan. And they're like, well, I don't do animal sacrifices or imagine that my wife or my daughter are in any danger of being raped by Zeus in the form of a goose. Why would you use that word? And so here again, what we're doing is we're struggling looking for language that can adequately represent what's going on around us. And we're pretty much stuck with the language of the past until we arrive at new language that seems to fit and will actually take off and work well.
But I think it's more helpful and really, in a sense, more perspicuous, let's say, to understand paganism as immanent religiosity. Put it this way, if religion, which of course is a much disputed term, is taken to refer to an orientation toward the sacred, then we can ask for somebody, what is the sacred for them? Or more specifically, where is the sacred? And the pagan answer is the sacred exists within this world. It's immanent. It's an immanent religiosity. Now, I don't think that in defining paganism this way, there's anything really contrived about the definition either. Basically, that's, I think, the same conceptions used in the really remarkable recent book by Anthony Kronman, Confessions of a Born-Again Pagan. But it's also, I think, really faithful to ancient paganism. In the 1st century BC, the scholar Marcus Varro distinguished among mythic religion, basically stories about gods and goddesses and so forth, civic religion, the sacrifices and auguries and so forth, and we might use the term philosophical religion.
Now, this was the quote that I was thinking of when I was talking to Adam and Sitch, that in the 1st century they recognized mythic religion, civic religion. Civic religion, you're maintaining. Now, again, this is the operating system, and this is what Tom Holland talks about with respect to. The Greeks didn't know they were religious. Well, you have to have the sacrifice. You have to have the statue, the monument. If you play Civilization, monument building adds culture. You have to have the monument. You have to have the statue. You have to have the symbols. You have to have the sacrifice. You have to have the rituals. And, what's happening right now politically is you have the Democratic convention, but it's not a convention where you're drawing people because of COVID. What is it? It's a ritual. It's a show. You have to have the ritual. If you don't have the ritual, the city won't prosper. Now, again, new atheists look at that and say, ha, that statue, that doesn't do anything. Those sacrifices, those don't do anything. Peterson comes in with the making the observation that the future and the past are so full of people that you can't have the city without the sacrifice. The sacrifices work. The statues work. Now, on one level, we understand how they work psychologically, how they work sociologically. You in fact, even deeper than the operating system, the sort of the assembly language and the drivers that connect up the hardware to the software, our cities don't work without this symbolism, without these archetypes. These are so deep within us, and they've continued to be built and evolved over time, but they don't work without it. Now, again, the modern dismissal of that stuff is, we don't need that. But then modernists build Washington, D.C., full of the Washington Monument, which is an Egyptian obelisk, and Lincoln Memorial, which is the temple of Zeus. I mean, any ancient who would go to the mall in Washington, D.C., and the statues would say, "You're using the same technology we are." Well, and they'd say, "Yeah, but you didn't think about this in the same way that we did." Do you really know how you work? I don't think so. And so, in fact, this operating system, the sacrifices and the statues and the myths, these are all functions of how the ancient city works. And they're surrounded by stories, and they're surrounded by implicit understandings of what is important. And if we lose this, we'll lose everything. And so, of course, when the Christian barbarians sack Rome and tear down the statues of the pagans, well, the pagans are, you're killing our culture. Really? Why? Well, that's how cultures work. And Smith's going to get into this stuff.
And it was possible, he said, to scoff at the mythic religion, as Varro and many others did, even perhaps at the civic religion. And scholar Marcus Varro distinguished among mythic religion, basically stories about gods and goddesses and so forth, civic religion, the sacrifices and auguries and so forth, and we might use the term philosophical religion. And it was possible, he said, to scoff at the mythic religion, as Varro and many others did, even perhaps at the civic religion, as Seneca did, at least according to Augustine, and still embrace the philosophical religion, then treating the stories about gods and goddesses and the sacrifices and so forth as kind of symbolic or expressive manifestations of this deeper, immanent religiosity. This probably was actually the position of many educated Romans at the time.
Now again, pay attention. You've got the dynamics of you've got the spectrum of the folk religion and then the pure religions, and it's not really a spectrum because it's way too linear, but we need this. And you find these positions today. You find people that say, we just gotta look what's going away. We just have to get rid of all of that superstition. And then others are saying, well, do you really imagine you're going to have a society with everyone with IQs of 120 or more, as if IQ actually correlates with religiosity? Well, education correlates with it. Well, what exactly is education? Well, it's sitting in a room and being indoctrinated by a group of people who believe a certain set of beliefs. Oh, you mean programming? Yeah.
Now, in this context, the rise of Christianity and Judaism was a radical development. Scholars like Jan Osman have explained, precisely because Christians and Jews believed in a transcendent deity. And this belief had revolutionary implications for views of the world, sexuality, civic obligation, and life generally. Now, as we know, in the 4th and 5th centuries, there was a kind of on-again, off-again struggle between Christianity and paganism within the Roman Empire, and Christianity eventually prevailed as an official matter, but that's an important qualifier. This is sometimes described as the Christian Revolution, and of course it set the stage for centuries of Christendom and so forth. And yet I think it would be a mistake to think that paganism simply disappeared. In fact, I would say it survived and even flourished in various ways, but I'll mention three. One is, I think paganism persisted and indeed was cherished in the sort of historical memory of the West. There was a long-standing, ongoing admiration for and a desire to recover the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome, to use Poe's phrase. The Renaissance, of course, was a sort of emphatic manifestation of this theme, and that theme is easily observable in a lot of the paintings of the great Renaissance masters. Secondly, and kind of conversely, in the Western imagination, I think there's been a persistent resentment towards, often hostility toward, the force that turned out the lights on, as Heinrich Heine put it, the merry dance of paganism, namely Christianity, a resentment toward Christianity. That's been an ongoing theme too, but the Enlightenment is often seen as a conspicuous manifestation of that theme. In Peter Gay's admired history of the Enlightenment, he emphasizes this anti-Christian theme and describes the Enlightenment as the rise of modern paganism. That's his subtitle for one of his volumes. But third, and perhaps even more importantly, I think it can plausibly be argued.
Now, seeing the Enlightenment as the rise of modern paganism is very interesting because, again, if you think about it in terms of Smith's schema here, well, the Enlightenment is an immanentizing motion of, let's say, the thought that the culture was just simply floating too far above it. Now this stuff is really nuanced and difficult because, of course, the Protestant Reformation is, on one hand, sort of a floating above the sacramentality of medieval Catholicism. So in some ways, you've got things moving in both directions. And that's what makes it very difficult to talk about these things. But Peterson has this take on Jung that, the heirs of alchemy basically turned their efforts towards using the creation for the betterment of us here and now, of earth rather than heaven. And so this ongoing little debate about how Christian is the Enlightenment, Smith's thesis actually, I think, illuminates part of that debate by noting that, well, there's an immanentizing aspect to Enlightenment. So if you're going to associate that with paganism, now again, these terms are terribly fraught. Fair enough, but what's ironic there, of course, is that if you were to tell a contemporary university professor that they are pagan, they'd say, "No, I'm not pagan. I'm scientific." But understand Stephen Smith's definition of pagan. We don't have a better word. You're an immanentist. You're not worried about life of the age to come. You're worried about the life here and now.
Argued that paganism, or a tendency to sacralize the things of this world, is in a sense the natural condition of humanity. And perhaps even more importantly, I think it can plausibly be argued that paganism, or a tendency to sacralize the things of this world, is in a sense the natural condition of humanity. We live in this world. This is the world we know firsthand, that we're sure of. Anything beyond this world we know only through intimation or inference. And insofar as humanity, or a tendency to sacralize the things of this world.
So here, okay, so how can we understand his schema? So paganism is a tend to sacralize the things of this world. Now, does that really work? Because again, an Enlightenment person would look at the ancient Greeks and say, no, the special stone or the sacred statue, and he would say, okay, but the statue's here in this world. So you sort of have to go with him here. But again, I think going with his thesis illuminates some of the dynamics that we see presently around us, even if we don't really sort of have our language straight with this.
Is in a sense the natural condition of humanity. We live in this world. This is the world we know.
Now notice the natural condition of humanity. Already there's one of the ways to track these ideas is to pay attention to what exactly do you mean by this word natural? Because, again, you can look at Lewis, who's looking at a classicist. Nature is a woman. Mother Nature. Nature has consciousness. Nature can be fickle. Nature moves our attention around. No, nature is a machine. It's a clock. Nature is, there's no consciousness to it. It's just mercilessly, pitilessly going about what it does. So nature is group A, this mechanistic thing. Group B are things with will that act within it.
Firsthand that we're sure of, any tendency to sacralize the things of this world is in a sense the natural condition of humanity. We live in this world. This is the world we know firsthand that we're sure of. Anything beyond this world we know only through intimation or inference. And insofar as we are oriented toward the sacred, we naturally tend to locate the sacred within this world. This is actually a pretty familiar point. It's been stressed in Scripture and 1,000 homilies over the centuries by preachers and so forth. So I think it actually might plausibly be argued that despite the official triumph of Christianity in late antiquity, paganism actually remained a sort of dominant position or orientation throughout the intervening centuries.
And again, when we get into our sacramental conversation, because again, sacraments are portals into the other world, into the next world. Well, that's what makes them sacred. In this sense, so perhaps in a pagan sense, in an enchanted sense, the sacred image isn't necessarily a portal into that world, but it's a portal from that world of the power that can be deployed and wielded in this world. Perhaps that's the sense of paganism that we're struggling with and trying to define and deal with here.
But even Christianity in late antiquity, paganism actually remained a sort of dominant position or orientation throughout the intervening centuries. But even so, and this is important too, over those centuries of Christendom, basically, Christianity has remained sort of the official position. It's supplied the regulative ideal for governing law and politics and culture and so forth.
And I think part of the reason Christianity and transcendental religions lend themselves to this so much is because it is a unifying thing. There is a monarchical nature to it. There is one God. There is finally one final court of justice that will make a definitive decision. There's a coalescing aspect to monotheism and these transcendent religions. I've been thinking lately about the function of speech with respect to the up and the down, heaven and earth. Again, I mentioned this in a previous video. I was watching, my wife and my daughter were watching these shows about like Married at First Sight and some of these things. And you watch these people do this insane thing, and then of course the whole premise of the television show is that they sit there and they talk about it, and you put the camera in front of their mug and yak, and so I listen to what comes out of their mouth. And how many of them are using these moral declarations verbally. There is something to the logos aspect of reality where, again, the word love, well, the form, the word endures. Every love is subject to the maelstrom of what's going on in the world. But the ideal, the word, and so in some ways, once you instantiate something in a word, you've given it a non-decayable form that is transcendent in a way. And so when it comes to organizing things like law, there's an aspect to, well, write the contract down on paper. And you almost get a hierarchy of, well, words coming out of my mouth, well, that's more than just actions. that connects up with the brain. And then words on paper, well, that then is sort of fixed. And I mean, we're sort of moving up the chain in that way.
Paganism, I would argue, has remained strong, but mostly beneath the surface, not the official position. But this may be where I think things have changed recently. I argue in the book that immanent religiosity is becoming more self-conscious and aggressive. You can see this in various places. In the book, I particularly discuss the work of Ronald Dworkin, especially his last book, Religion Without God, but it's apparent in other ways as well. And if that's right, then it wouldn't be surprising to see a more deliberate effort to throw off the vestiges of Christianity as the regulative ideal. And I argue in the book that this, in fact, is what we see in recent decades. I teach constitutional law sometimes and write about it, so I talk about this in the area of constitutional law, and I think it helps to illuminate developments in the area of new constitutional rights, reflecting the sexual revolution, things concerned with marriage, also in the area of religious freedom. And this can be described, I think, as a kind of pagan counter-revolution, as an attempt to reverse the Christian revolution of late antiquity. Now, that discussion in the book takes up 2 or 3 chapters, and I won't try to summarize those here. But instead, I want to turn now briefly to the question that we're talking about on this panel. Do we see now the emergence of a new American religion, as paganism as a sort of regulative ideal, replacing Christianity or biblical religion, Judeo-Christianity, as the regulative ideal? I think it can only be tentative in addressing that question, but my answer would be yes and no. In one sense, more yes than no, and in another sense, more no than yes. So let me just sort of try to explain the yes part. I think it's plausible to say that an immanent religiosity has been the dominant, if tacit, orthodoxy for some time now. It's driven constitutional developments, as I say, and a lot else. I think it's dominant in the academy. I think it's dominant in the entertainment industry. This is not so much a prediction of what may be coming as a sort of fait accompli. But on the no side, I think that paganism or immanent religion may flourish best when it stays beneath the surface. It may be parasitic on something else, when it's camouflaged as secular neutrality or a kind of reverent scientific naturalism, or maybe as a kind of liberal Christianity, though that's a chapter I didn't put in the book, but it's a chapter that could have been written. When paganism comes, or immanent religiosity comes out in the open as its own thing, then it may need to defend and justify itself, and it's not clear to me that it can do that convincingly. Maybe it is just too spiritually and intellectually thin to flourish, when it's actually viewed for what it is. Now, Ross, in a column a while back in the New York Times, raised questions about whether modern paganism would have the cultic resources that a successful religion would need, and I think that is a good question. But I want to just quickly point to several other deficiencies, all of which are very debatable. But one, I think that as a philosophical position, the paganism, he doesn't call it that, but he calls it religion, of somebody like Ronald Dworkin, just lacks the coherence and the rigor that either a hardcore scientific naturalism has or that Christianity has. Dworkin, he asserts, basically, that we believe in objective value, not merely subjective value, an objective meaning to life, not merely subjective. But it isn't really clear what these things even mean or what ontological foundation they have for him. Anthony Kronman's paganism, which is basically Spinoza, is a whole different story, and I don't have the time or frankly, the competence to talk about that here. But I think that is one issue. A second concern, I think, is that the normative attractiveness of modern paganism consists in commitments to things like human equality and human dignity, but these are basically inherited, I would argue, from the Christian or Judeo-Christian, the biblical sort of tradition, and it's not clear that they're sustainable, if they're removed from that sort of foundation.
There's, as I noted before, the immanentism probably has a weakness with respect to allowing people to form principalities and allowing people to form successful principalities and institutions, because that transcendent move sort of pulls people up with it and affords a certain shaping discipline, whereas, well, it's good for me but not good for you, and then we sort of have this libertarian thing going that I'll do me, you do you, but what happens if we're both living in the street and my me-ness and your you-ness offends one or the other, and so it breaks down. So at some point, you're going to have to come to some kind of larger compromise, and that's suddenly when someone says, well, I think it's wrong that you do that. So once you use that word wrong, well, you're already moving in the transcendent direction, that there's right and wrong, or right for me and wrong for me. Okay, well, now we're being quite imminent, but wrong period, well, now we're already moving in that direction.
Just a third sort of final point here. I think modern immanent religiosity is primarily committed to secondary values, you might say, to things like human equality and dignity and autonomy. The goal, in other words, is sort of to enable human beings to live the kind of life that they choose or that we choose. But paganism doesn't have much to say about what to choose, about what kind of life really is valuable. Walter.
Again, communally. Now, what I choose, or my experience of choosing, especially if we just try to forget that even my own choices and desires have been formed and in many ways groomed by this consumeristic culture, so that, oh yes, of course I want Coke, or of course I want an Apple, or of course I want this other high status piece of clothing. Why do we all want the same thing we all want together, when in 1970 that thing would have been unthinkable? So again, we're dealing with other nuances in this dynamic.
Lippmann talked about this years ago in What Kind of Life Really Is Valuable. Walter Lippmann talked about this years ago in a really important book, I think, written in the 1920s, A Preface to Morals. And he says, here's a quote, "Having won the freedom to do what they wish, modern people, they do not know what they wish to do." He said these sort of secondary values don't really tell us what a good life consists of. So as I said, I think there is a lot to debate here and a lot that's speculative, but these kinds of considerations lead me to be skeptical about whether there's a new American religion in the sense of an immanent religiosity or paganism that we could really settle into. And I sort of think it's more likely that we're going to have an ongoing, continuing conflict and confusion over some of these things. Thanks.
Okay, that in some ways is a teaser, because in the next lectures he goes into a lot more detail. So yeah, 4.5 hours of lecture and some very good question and answer, challenging some of his ideas, debating them. So he's a law professor, so he's used to arguing. And they're really outstanding videos, and they're done, by the way, by Erdman's Publishing, Grand Rapids, Michigan. When I was a seminary student, some of these books I bought at the Erdman's bookstore, because at the bookstore they had misprints and seconds and things, and as a seminary student I could go in there and get those books at 70% off, and I sort of liked that. It was affordable to me. So again, we'll see what kind of time I have. It's my wife's birthday today, so special things tonight for her. But starting a clip channel, because I want to take some of these ideas and put them in smaller things, because some of you are going to look at an 1.5-hour video. Well, if you're listening to my channel, you're not going to have that, but I want to elevate some of these ideas more than they are, and I'd like to elevate some of his ideas more than they are, because I think actually they have a place in this conversation. And maybe, even though I don't do this very often, I might reach out to him and see if this is something he might be interested in. So again, back to the thesis of this video, we're seeing the end of liberal modernity, and the IDW can't win it back. Many of the gains many of the gains don't go away, but they are threatened, and I think that's part of the task at times like these. When the major paradigms are shifting, how can we sift and say, this is worth keeping, and this is how we're going to try and keep it, and this we can sort of let go? And you see this, many times I've argued that part of the benefit of knowing your religion, knowing your operating system, is that if your religion is very durable and can keep its narrative thread over long periods of time, this shifting is always happening with us. And we're trying to say, well, this is worth keeping and this is worth letting go. And then, as often happens, some things that are very old, if they've been preserved, they can be brought back. That, obviously part of the Renaissance, which will have a part in this conversation. Part of Erasmus, who with the printing press, and Martin Luther, and sort of, revivified, studying of Greek and Hebrew, not just Latin, for Protestant clergy, because the church wanted its Protestant clergy to at least have some background in the biblical languages. So you see those Renaissance values persisting, and we could have an interesting conversation how much of the Renaissance was a pagan revival, and so what does the Roman Catholic Church do when Aristotle comes back on the scene? First they ban Aristotle, but then Aquinas comes in and says, I think we can use this. And of course, then scholasticism and Aquinas using Aristotle shapes the path for the Roman Catholic Church. So, Augustine and Neoplatonism, and then Aquinas and Aristotle, and well, now we're into modernity, and so all of these things. And so we're always doing this grand sifting thing, and it's all of this stuff flowing through. But no, modernity is going away. And not in my lifetime. I mean, these things move slowly, but we can feel it. We can sense it happening, and the signs are there, and the IDW won't save it. The scientific assumptions, those are powerful tools. They're not going away, but they'll continue to be a re-examination. And so kind of the clumsy woke pushback on science, it's science is simply too useful to wholeheartedly discard by the people who are using it. A lot of the people for whom it's just kind of this thing that we hear about going on out there, but yet we run to the store and benefit from the fruits of science and technology, and not looking to get rid of that. If we were to tell people that, well, Henry Ford was a racist, which he was. Henry Ford was a racist, and if you think about all the ideas that Henry Ford had, don't use any product of industrialization. Yeah, fat chance. It's not going to happen. What about the Wright brothers? They were awfully white. Don't go on an airplane because an airplane has implicit whiteness in it. Fat chance that's going to happen. So the sorting method is, on one hand, enormously practical, but it's very nuanced and it's very messy, and there are a lot of blunt instruments, but over time, hopefully, really dumb, unworthy ideas get exposed and pass away. We often look at other ideas and say, why hasn't this passed away? Well, there might be reasons for it that we can't see, and that's why they endure. Or maybe you just have a community of people that have made that a sacred thing within their community, and that's giving it extra power as it's going through history. So scientific assumptions, they're redefining. Scientific assumptions, of course, happened because we redefined regularity as mechanistic. First we saw movement, thought, oh, that's life. And now we see movement, say, no, that's dead. That's just physics. That's just movement. There's no consciousness. There's no intent. There's no plan. Again, this is the foundations of the meaning crisis that John Vervaeke walks through in his awakening from the meaning crisis thing. And then the limitation of variables to illuminate operations. So I go closer to the fence, and that thing, so I see better with my old eyes, and I touch it and say, no, that's a cobweb. Categorically, that's not alive. The bee, that was alive, but the bee is programmed. The bee isn't here because the bee suddenly watched YouTube and saw Paul Vanderklay and didn't like his ideas, and so found his way to Paul Vanderklay's backyard in order to sting him. That level of consciousness is not within a bee's frame. But is there any kind of divine operation at work that does in fact bring the bee into my backyard, or does in fact cause the wind to blow and the cobweb moves along the fence, and I go and I see and say, oh, it's not alive, it's a cobweb. All of these categorizations are built into us, okay? And we don't see these things. These are assumptions on our part, but humanity is incredibly programmable, and these things change. So one person sees a bee and says, that bee's presence here is meaningless. Another person sees a bee and says, God by his providence sent that bee to me. So we're going to be sifting through modernity as it continues to recede. As this knowledge grows, the knowledge of the recession here, and is applied to ourselves, these group B persons, to the degree that we have not been completely consumed by this meaning crisis and said, I am just piano keys. Well, to the degree that that comes upon you, you have a meaning crisis. And in many ways, that's where Dostoyevsky comes to the fore and says, tell us we're piano keys and we'll smash them. It's sort of like Marty McFly in Back to the Future, simplistic button and trigger on him, call him yellow, and he, does whatever he does. I am not a piano key. I will defy reason and act out of my secret, sacred self and do this thing, and this is sort of where the immanent religiosity and the transcendent religiosity schema sort of breaks down, because what's happened, which I think confirms Dostoyevsky in certain of these folk New Age religions, is that, well, it's not immanent on earth and it's not transcendent from God, it's beneath the earth. And there's a secret, sacred self that is mysterious, and that's the source of it. It's sort of a new re-enchanting from below. Now, spite will drive you to do the irrational, just because, how much Playboy Mansion will really finally satisfy you. It is it's kind of an unintentional subconscious will to power mode that I am going to resolve the meaning crisis by standing up and taking action. And there's an element of that in Peterson's work, where his challenge to stand up and, shake the Cheetos dust off you and go out into the public square and make a commitment to that woman and have a family and assert yourself. Be an agent. Have agency out there. You are not a piano key. Be a person. Well, is that from the secret, sacred self, or does that come from above? And so noble aims often whisper legends of another world. Now this very much gets us into the two myths mythology. And Stephen Smith will, in a number of these lectures, bring out this quote from Bertrand Russell that so typifies atheist, secularist modernism, but it's sort of a despairing, immanent religion. That man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end they are achieving. Again, there's no purpose or end out there. That is his origin, his growth, his hopes and tears, his loves and his beliefs. They are the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve the individual life beyond the grave, that all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievements must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. The irony, of course, is that this philosophy is not standing and can't seem to muster enough of a popular group behind it to sustain itself. There's always a little remnant of 2 to 5 to 8% of people that say, yes, I'm going to choose this and I'm going to assign this heroically, and others look at it and say, what's the point? Look at your thing. What's the point? Whether you're heroically going into the darkness, well, there's a soundtrack to that, and it looks nice in the moment, but Is it really any improvement over the dude with the Cheetos just in the underground man? Only within these scaffoldings of new truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. That's the certainty you want? I talk to a fair number of people who are depressed and want to stay that way. Well, there you have it. Is that noble? Is that dignified? It sets up the two worlds mythology, because then you have the question of, well, what to do with the loss and the chaos and the seeming pointless suffering in this world? Well, the Christian answer is that, well, actually, it makes sense in another realm. And this is what you get from Chesterton and Father Brown. I mean that we here, on the wrong side of the tapestry, we're in a sense on the wrong side of history, answered Father Brown, the things that happen here do not seem to mean anything. They mean something somewhere else. Somewhere else, retribution will come on the real offender. Here it often seems to fall on the wrong person. Now, ask yourself, which world can afford justice? Part of the reason the new wokeism won't last is not only are people not thinking through it clearly and not actually offering coherent formulations of it, but justice, I think, has a secularity problem and the atheist problem. And the atheist problem, Bertrand Russell lays out well. People get away with it all the time. And whether you got away with it or whether you didn't, it's destined for that extinction, the fast death of the solar system, that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. It's Charlton Heston in the Planet of the Apes crying before the Statue of Liberty. But it makes no sense. It means nothing. There's no point. There's not the hope of another world in which humanity's self-destruction somehow can be redeemed and accounted for, which is something that obviously Dostoyevsky was looking forward to. We only seem to really work, find meaning, pursuing a world that we must admit is always out of reach. But we decide it's a piano key trick. And if we decide it's that, well, it won't work because, oh yeah, that's a trick. I look at the blowing cobweb and say, oh yeah, that's the cobweb. Fooled me once, not going to fool me again. It's just a cobweb. The universe is dead inside, and I'm afraid I am too. It doesn't work. It needs to be a viable option. There needs to be a hope that all of this, these videos, these hours of videos, these listening to videos, these having children, these having a job, this fight for justice actually means something and contributes something on the other side of the tapestry. Death can't be all there is, finally. And so, really, I think, in terms of his schema, the reunion of heaven and earth still holds. That could it be that part of why paganism hangs around and Christianity and paganism continue to sort of mix and in this grand sifting with every new big cultural transition, we do more sifting and we use new information that we've had, and unfortunately we forget old information, and so then we reach back and we pull it up and we say, well maybe this helps us make sense. And so, as G.K. Chesterton says, we give our ancestors a seat at the table and we listen to them, and we hope that somehow heaven and earth will be united. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That is, in a sense, the resolution of the human story told by the Bible. And there's clues and intimations that there's things beyond that, and very good things beyond that make sense of this world. But science can't tell you that because of what science is. So, yeah, more stuff on Stephen Smith, more stuff on his on his lectures. I've ordered his book. It hasn't come yet. Might come today. But I think it very much pertains. It pertains at many of the different conversations that we're having. So leave a comment.